The air in Kenzo Tanaka's penthouse was as cold and sterile as an operating theater. Outside, a torrential November rain lashed against the panoramic windows, but inside, not a sound penetrated the triple-paned glass. The silence was a weapon, one Kenzo usually wielded with surgical precision. Tonight, however, it was being used against him. Seated across the sprawling granite table were three men from the Seoul-based Golden Viper Syndicate, their faces impassive, their dark suits seeming to absorb the light from the recessed fixtures above. Their leader, a man known only as Mr. Choi, tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the table's surface, the rhythmic tick-tick-tick a maddening metronome counting down Kenzo's dwindling authority. Kenzo, the formidable head of the Kageyama-kai, the most feared Japanese mafia organization in the city, felt a cold knot of panic tightening in his gut, an emotion so foreign to him it was physically nauseating. His translator, a man who had served him for a decade, was currently in an intensive care unit, the victim of a suspicious hit-and-run just 3 hours ago. Without him, Kenzo was functionally deaf and mute. He understood a few pleasantries in Korean, enough for a restaurant, but not nearly enough to negotiate the treacherous currents of a multi-million-dollar arms deal. Mr. Choi knew this. He had orchestrated it. The man's lips curled into a slight, mocking smile as he spoke in a low, rapid stream of Korean, the words washing over Kenzo with the meaningless cadence of the rain outside. Kenzo's right-hand man, Haruki, stood stiffly by the window, his jaw clenched, so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. He could do nothing. They were trapped, outmaneuvered by the most basic of barriers. Language. The very foundation of Kenzo's power, control, information, intimidation, had been stripped away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in his own fortress. He maintained a mask of calm indifference, his dark eyes fixed on Mr. Choi, but inside, a primal rage was building. He was a king in his own castle, rendered a peasant by a few unintelligible syllables. The heavy oak door to the penthouse living area opened with a soft, electronic click, breaking the suffocating tension. Haruki turned, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol concealed beneath his jacket. A young woman stood hesitantly in the doorway, dwarfed by the cavernous space. She was an island of vibrant color in a sea of monochrome gray and black, clad in a bright red delivery jacket with a logo of Seoul Kitchen stitched over her heart. In her hands, she held a large paper bag, the fragrant steam of kimchi and bulgogi wafting from it, a shockingly mundane scent in this den of predators. She was African-American, perhaps 20 years old, with her hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that were wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension as she took in the opulent, minimalist decor. She looked from the grim-faced Haruki to the silent, imposing men at the table, her gaze finally landing on Kenzo. For a fleeting moment, she seemed to be the only real, living thing in a room of cold statues. She took a tentative step forward, her sneakers squeaking almost imperceptibly on the polished marble floor. "Delivery for a Mr. Tanaka?" she asked, her voice soft but clear, an American accent cutting through the oppressive quiet. Mr. Choi let out a low, contemptuous chuckle and said something in Korean to his men. The two subordinates smirked. They saw her as an amusing interruption, a fly buzzing into a spider's web, utterly insignificant. Zara Jones clutched the bag tighter. This wasn't a normal delivery. The air was thick with something heavy and dangerous, a feeling that went beyond the stern expressions of the men in expensive suits. She could feel the vibrations of unspoken violence in the floorboards. She just wanted to drop off the food, get her tip, and leave. This place, this entire floor, felt wrong. Her instincts screamed at her to turn and run, but she was frozen in place, a delivery girl who had just stumbled onto a stage where she most certainly did not belong. Mr. Choi leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malice. He looked directly at Kenzo, then gestured dismissively toward Zara with his chin. He spoke again in Korean, his tone dripping with condescension. "Tell your boss," he began, the words sharp and cruel, that he should have ordered a new translator instead of dinner. Perhaps this girl can count his losses for him. It seems to be all his kind is good for. The insult was layered, aimed not just at Kenzo's incompetence but at Zara's race and gender, a casual cruelty meant to assert his dominance in the room. His men snickered. Kenzo's face remained a stone mask, but a dark fire ignited in the depths of his eyes. He didn't need a translator to understand the universal language of contempt. He was about to signal Haruki to remove the girl and then deal with the consequences of this failed meeting when the unthinkable happened. Zara, who had been standing silently by the door, took a step forward. Her apprehension was gone, replaced by a cold, quiet fury. She placed the paper bag carefully on a nearby console table. Then, she turned to face Mr. Choi, her posture straightening, her chin lifting. In perfect, formal Korean, her pronunciation crisp and her cadence flawless, she spoke. "He is not my boss," she said, her voice ringing with an impossible clarity in the stunned silence. "And you should be careful. A dog that barks so loudly is often the first to be put down when the master grows tired of the noise." The effect was like a grenade detonating in the silent room. Mr. Choi's jaw literally dropped. His subordinates stared, their smirks vanishing, replaced by sheer disbelief. Haruki's eyes widened, a flicker of hope warring with his shock. Kenzo Tanaka, the powerful and unreadable Japanese mafia boss, felt his own composure crack for the first time. He stared at the delivery girl, at this complete stranger in a red jacket, and saw the single, impossible key to his salvation. He rose slowly from his chair, his presence filling the room. "You will not be leaving," he said, his voice a low command, spoken in English. It was not a request. He looked at Zara, and for the first time, his gaze held something other than cold authority. It held a desperate, burning intrigue. Zara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, tomb-like silence. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, for pairs belonging to killers and one belonging to their would-be victim. The weight of their collective shock was a physical pressure, threatening to crush her. Mr. Choi was the first to recover, his face contorting into a mask of rage and humiliation. He spat a furious question at her in Korean, demanding to know who she was, how she knew his language. Kenzo intervened before she could answer. He addressed her in English, his voice calm but laced with an undeniable authority that vibrated through the floor. "Translate for me," he commanded. "Everything he says. Everything I say. Do it exactly. There will be $10,000 in cash for you when this is over." The sum was astronomical, enough to solve every single one of her problems, and then some. It was a lifeline, but it was attached to an anchor that would drag her deep into a world she never knew existed. She looked at Kenzo's face, at the hard lines of his jaw, the unyielding intensity in his dark eyes. There was no escape. She had spoken, and in doing so, she had chosen a side. She gave a single, sharp nod. The negotiation resumed, but the entire dynamic had been inverted. Zara became the conduit, the bridge between two empires. She sat at the massive table, the now-cooling bag of Korean food a surreal reminder of the normal life she had left behind the moment she'd opened her mouth. Mr. Choi's words were venomous, filled with veiled threats and aggressive posturing. Zara translated them without flinching, her voice a cool, steady instrument that stripped the emotion away and left only the raw meaning. "Mr. Choi says the initial terms are no longer acceptable. He believes your unforeseen logistical problems demonstrate a weakness he must be compensated for. He wants a 30% increase in his share." Kenzo listened, his eyes never leaving Zara's face. He was watching how she handled the pressure, how her lips formed the foreign words, how a small muscle in her jaw tightened when Choi's language became particularly foul. He replied in a clipped, precise Japanese, which Haruki then translated to English for Zara. "Tell him," Kenzo said, via his two-step translation chain, "that a snake that gets too greedy often chokes on its meal." Zara relayed the message in flawless Korean. The verbal sparring continued for over an hour, a high-stakes chess match where she was the most critical piece on the board, moved and positioned by a king she had only just met. After another tense exchange, Mr. Choi held up a hand, calling for a recess. He and his men stood in unison and walked into an adjoining glass-walled conference room, their backs turned, but their hostile energy still palpable. The main room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was charged with questions. Haruki let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an hour. He looked at Zara with a reverence usually reserved for Kenzo. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" he asked, his voice rough with disbelief. Kenzo waved a hand, dismissing his subordinate. He wanted to ask the question himself. He walked around the table until he stood before her, not towering over her, but simply standing there, his imposing frame casting a long shadow. He asked my question. Kenzo said, his English precise.
How?
His gaze was intense, analytical, as if he were trying to deconstruct her, to understand the impossible mechanics of her existence in his world. Zara swallowed, her throat dry. I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of Korean families, she explained, her voice a little shaky now that the immediate threat had paused. My best friend's parents owned a restaurant. I worked there since I was 14. I listened. I learned. I took classes in college because I wanted to be good at it. It was just part of my life. Her explanation was so simple, so profoundly normal, that it seemed all the more extraordinary in this context. Her life's mundane texture had just saved one of the city's most powerful men from ruin. Kenzo considered her words, his expression unreadable. He saw the faint signs of exhaustion around her eyes, the worn fabric at the cuffs of her red jacket. She was a world away from his life of calculated violence and immense wealth, yet she possessed a strength and composure that many of his own hardened soldiers lacked. An unfamiliar emotion stirred within him, a strange, protective instinct. This young woman had single-handedly shifted the balance of power in the room. She was not merely a tool. She was a formidable presence. He gestured to the bar. Would you like some water? The offer was a small courtesy, yet from a man like Kenzo Tanaka, it felt like a significant concession, a crack in the icy facade. The Koreans returned from their conference, their expressions harder than before. The brief respite was over. Mr. Choi sat down, his movements sharp and aggressive. He didn't even look at Kenzo. He stared directly at Zara, a predatory gleam in his eyes. He began to speak, his Korean low and menacing. Zara's blood ran cold as she listened. She translated for Kenzo, her voice tight. He says the new price is non-negotiable. 50%. And she hesitated, the next words catching in her throat. Kenzo's eyes narrowed. And what? He pressed, his tone soft but insistent. Zara took a shallow breath. And as a sign of good faith, to ensure the deal proceeds smoothly. He wants me. He says a translator this valuable should not be left in the hands of someone who has already proven himself careless. It wasn't a business proposition. It was a violation, a move designed to utterly humiliate Kenzo by taking the very person who had become his lifeline. It was a threat aimed directly at her, turning her from a participant into a pawn to be captured. A profound stillness settled over Kenzo. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. The mask of impassive control didn't just crack. It disintegrated, revealing the cold, nihilistic fury of the predator beneath. He had faced threats his entire life. He had built an empire on his ability to meet and exceed any challenge with calculated, overwhelming force. But this was different. The threat was not against his business, his territory, or his life. It was against her. Against Zara Jones, the delivery girl in the red jacket who had stumbled into his life an hour ago and had shown more courage than men he had known for years. He felt a rage so pure and white-hot it threatened to consume him. In that instant, the multi-million-dollar arms deal became utterly irrelevant. The only thing in the world that mattered was the safety of the young woman sitting across from him, whose eyes now held a flicker of genuine fear. Kenzo leaned back in his chair, a move that was deceptively casual. He picked up his crystal glass of water, swirling the contents slowly. The clinking of the ice against the glass was the only sound. He did not look at Mr. Choi. His gaze was fixed on Zara, and he spoke to her in English, his voice a low, dangerous purr that was more terrifying than any shout. I am going to say something now, he began, his tone intimate, as if they were the only two people in the universe. And I need you to translate it for him. You must not soften a single word. You will use the most formal, most insulting honorifics you know. Do you understand me, Zara? She looked into his eyes, which were no longer cold and empty, but blazing with a protective fire. She saw the true face of the Japanese Mafia boss, and it was not the calm businessman, but the vengeful king. She nodded, her throat tight. He set the glass down with a soft click. He turned his head slowly, pinning Mr. Choi with a look of pure death. Then he began to speak in Japanese. Haruki, standing rigidly by the wall, translated for Zara in a hushed, urgent whisper. Tell him, Kenzo's voice began, translated through Haruki, that he is a filthy pig rooting in another man's garden. Tell him that for his insult, I will not just cancel our arrangement. I will personally fund his rivals until his entire organization is nothing but dust and bad memories. Tell him that if he or any of his men ever so much as breathe in this city again, I will have their tongues cut out and mailed to their mothers. The threat was so brutal, so specific, that Zara felt a tremor run through her as she repeated it in Korean. Her voice did not waver. She channeled the cold fury of the man beside her, her words landing like surgical strikes. Mr. Choi's arrogant facade finally crumbled, replaced by a pale, shocked horror. He had miscalculated. He had prodded a sleeping dragon, and now it was awake. Kenzo stood up, the movement signaling the end of the meeting, the end of the Golden Viper Syndicate's ambitions in a city, and perhaps the end of Mr. Choi himself. Get out of my home, he said in English, the words a final, icy dismissal. The silence that descended after Haruki had escorted the pale, trembling Koreans out of the penthouse was absolute. It was a heavy, ringing quiet, thick with the echoes of threats and the ghost of violence. Zara remained seated at the table, her hands clasped in her lap to stop them from shaking. The adrenaline that had sustained her was rapidly draining away, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a trembling vulnerability. The room, which had felt like a stage, now felt like a cage. Kenzo walked to the panoramic window, his back to her, and stared out at the rain-streaked city, lights below. He was a silhouette of immense power, a dark figure against a glittering backdrop of a world that was entirely his. For a long time, he said nothing. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was unreadable again, the fire in his eyes banked to embers. They are gone, he stated simply. He walked to a safe concealed behind a minimalist painting and withdrew a thick stack of cash, which he placed on the table in front of her. $10,000. As promised, the money felt wrong now. It felt like a payment for a service, a transactional end to an ordeal that had felt deeply, terrifyingly personal. Zara looked at the stack of bills and then back at him. She couldn't go back. That was the thought that screamed in her mind. She couldn't just walk out of this penthouse, get on the elevator, and go back to delivering bibimbap. Mr. Choi had seen her face. He knew she spoke Korean. He knew she was now, in his eyes, Kenzo Tanaka's asset. As if reading her mind, Kenzo spoke again, his voice softer now. You cannot go back to your life, Zara Jones, he said, using her full name for the first time. It sounded strange and significant on his lips. They know who you are. They will see you as a weakness of mine to be exploited, or a loose end to be eliminated. Your apartment, your job. They are no longer safe for you. His words were not a threat, but a statement of cold, hard fact. His world, with all its darkness and danger, had reached out and claimed her. The red delivery jacket she wore felt like a costume from another lifetime. I can't just disappear, Zara whispered, the words feeling futile even as she said them. I have a life. I have rent to pay, classes. Her voice trailed off. What did any of that matter now? What was a midterm exam compared to a mafia boss marking you for death? Kenzo closed the distance between them, stopping just a few feet away. His presence was overwhelming, a gravitational force that seemed to pull all the air in the room toward him. Your old life is over, he stated, not with cruelty, but with a grim finality. But I am offering you a new one. He gestured around the vast, empty penthouse. Stay here, with me. I will give you anything you desire, an education, wealth, comfort. Anything. In return, I ask for your loyalty. And I promise you, he added, his gaze locking onto hers, his voice dropping to a near whisper, no one will ever harm you again. I will be your shield. The offer hung in the air between them, a gilded cage, a beautiful prison. It was a choice that was not a choice at all. Safety and luxury in exchange for her freedom. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the fear warring with a pragmatic understanding of her new reality. He took another step closer, his expression softening in a way she never would have thought possible. For the first time in a decade, he confessed, the admission costing him a visible effort. I was not in control tonight. I was weak. You gave me back my strength. But you showed me something else. He couldn't articulate it. The flicker of humanity, the spark of defiant courage in a world of hardened monsters. He was the powerful Japanese mafia boss, a man who took whatever he wanted, but in this moment, he was asking. He was not commanding. He was offering a pact, a partnership born of violence and necessity, but one that felt like something more. He gestured for Haruki, who had re-entered the room silently. "Show Miss Jones to the West Wing suite. Give her anything she needs." Zara followed Haruki through silent, art-filled hallways that felt more like a museum than a home. The suite he led her to was larger than her entire apartment. It had its own balcony overlooking the glittering, rain-slicked city, a four-poster bed with silk sheets, and a bathroom carved from a single slab of white marble. It was a palace, and it was a prison. Alone, she walked to the floor-to-ceiling mirror and stared at her reflection. A tired-looking girl in a worn, bright red delivery jacket. She looked utterly out of place, a splash of garish, working-class color in a world of cold, calculated elegance. She thought of her old life, the constant worry about bills, the exhaustion of working 2 jobs while studying, the small, cramped apartment that was barely hers. It was a hard life, but it was hers. Now she had this. Safety, luxury, and the constant, terrifying presence of Kenzo Tanaka. She thought of the look in his eyes when he had threatened Mr. Choi, the unrestrained, possessive fury. It was a look that had been on her behalf. It was terrifying, and yet, a part of her, a part she was ashamed to acknowledge, had felt a sense of profound, absolute security. An hour later, there was a soft knock on her door. She opened it to find Kenzo standing there, holding a lacquered tray. On it were the containers of Korean food she had delivered hours ago, now elegantly replated on fine porcelain. He had warmed them up himself. "You never got to eat," he said, his voice quiet. He set the tray down on a small table. The gesture was so simple, so unexpectedly domestic, it disarmed her completely. They sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound the soft clinking of her chopsticks against the bowl. "I don't even know your first name," she said finally. "Kenzo," he replied. "My name is Kenzo." She looked at him, at the man who commanded a criminal empire, who had ordered deaths and built fortunes on fear, now sitting in a suite in his home, watching her eat takeout. She saw the profound loneliness in his guarded eyes, the immense weight of the crown he wore. He, in turn, saw not a translator or a pawn, but the woman whose unexpected strength had captivated him. Zara finished her meal, then slowly, deliberately, she took off her red jacket and folded it, placing it on a chair. It was an act of surrender and an act of acceptance. "Okay, Kenzo," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'll stay." His expression didn't change, but a flicker of something deep and elemental passed through his eyes. It was not the end of her story, but the terrifying, exhilarating, and uncertain beginning of a new one.